John Matthews had given Horizon Dynamics 20 years of his life, 20 years of long nights, quiet weekends spent in the office instead of at home, and countless emergencies where his steady hands had saved the company from digital collapse. At 56, he wasn't just another employee, he was the backbone of the entire IT department. Yet on a gray Monday morning in Dallas, his world came crashing down. Mark Dillon, his polished young boss with an MBA and a habit of speaking in buzzwords, summoned him into the office. Sitting beside him was Karen Lopez from Human Resources, her expression carefully neutral, as if she were reading from a script. John, Mark said flatly, "We're eliminating your position. Please clear your desk by noon." No handshake. No thank you. Just cold dismissal. As John walked back to his cubicle, his co-workers, many of them young coders he had personally trained, avoided eye contact. Tapping nervously at their keyboards, he gathered his belongings methodically, a framed family photo, the coffee mug his daughter gave him on Father's Day, a small cactus that had somehow survived under fluorescent lights for nearly 2 decades. On the surface, John looked calm, but deep inside something had shifted. Mark Dillon thought he was simply cutting loose an aging technician. What he didn't realize was that John Matthews carried with him more than memories. He carried secrets that could change everything. John Matthews had been there when Horizon Dynamics was nothing more than a handful of dreamers renting a small floor in an aging office park. Back then, he was just a young father with a knack for computers, working late nights while his wife, Linda, kept the kids quiet so he could focus. 2 decades later, Horizon had grown into a skyscraper in downtown Dallas, company valued in the billions, and John was still there quietly, faithfully, keeping everything running. He wasn't flashy, not the type to give big presentations or chase promotions. But if a server went down at 2 in the morning, it was John who answered the call. If a virus slipped past the firewalls, John patched it before management even realized the danger. He had guided the company from dial-up connections and floppy disks to cloud migration and cybersecurity protocols strong enough to survive mergers and acquisitions. 3 different CEOs had come and gone during his career, each bringing in their own teams and strategies. But John remained the constant thread. Younger employees sometimes laughed about his old-school ways, his habit of carrying a paper notebook filled with scribbles, diagrams, and passwords only he seemed to understand. But those same young coders knew that when disaster struck, John was the man to run to. He had trained nearly every one of them, showing them not just how to code, but how to think, how to solve problems under pressure. He was like the quiet uncle in a family, the one who never asked for recognition, but without whom the whole household would fall apart. Linda often teased that. Horizon servers were his second family. On birthdays and Christmas mornings, she could recall at least a dozen times when he had to slip away from the table, laptop in hand, to fix some emergency. They'd collapse without you, she told him more than once. And though John chuckled, a part of him knew it was true. That was the irony of what happened in Mark Dillon's office. The young boss with the perfect hair and the MBA credentials might have thought he was letting go of an obsolete technician. But John Matthews was not obsolete. He was irreplaceable. He had written the custom software that still powered Horizon's most important systems. He knew the hidden back doors, the passwords buried 3 levels deep, the workarounds that no consultant could ever figure out. But here's the part Mark Dillon and Karen Lopez didn't understand. Wasn't extraordinary because of brilliance or ego. He was extraordinary because of discipline. It documented everything, building a system of checks and safeguards when no one else cared. Years earlier, during a scandal involving data breaches, the legal department had asked him to create audit protocols. John had not only created them, he had kept copies off-site backups that the executives had long forgotten about. So when they told him to leave, when they stripped him of his badge and watched to make sure he walked out the door, they didn't realize that John still carried the heart of Horizon's history with him. Not on his shoulders, not in his office, but in the secure, quiet files he had preserved over 20 years. Walking to his car that morning, cardboard box in his hands, John looked up at the gleaming tower that had consumed the best years of his life, Most people would have felt broken, discarded like old equipment. But John didn't feel broken. He felt steady, watchful, because he knew something the others didn't. Beneath the surface of Horizon's success, there were cracks forming patterns he had already begun to notice. And now, without the weight of loyalty holding him back, John Matthews was finally free to follow those cracks to the truth. For most of his 20 years at Horizon Dynamics, John Matthews had believed that loyalty meant stability. He kept his head down, worked hard, and trusted that if he did his job well, the company would value him. But looking back, he realized the warning signs had been there for months, subtle at first, easy to dismiss. It began with small changes. To his system access, at first, he thought it was a glitch, one of those routine updates that shifted permissions without explanation. But then it happened again and again. The folder he had always managed was suddenly restricted. At admin panel he had created now told him he didn't have clearance. It wasn't enough to stop him from doing his job, but it was just enough to make him notice. At meetings, too, his presence seemed to matter less. Projects he would normally lead were handed to younger employees. Emails about new initiatives arrived without his name on the list. He told himself it was just part of modernization after all. He'd seen plenty of reorganizations over 2 decades. But in his gut, he knew this was different. He wasn't just being overlooked. He was being pushed aside. The true shift came when Mark Dillon hired a consultant, Eric Lawson. The man arrived in sharp suits that probably cost more than John's entire wardrobe. Eric shook hands with everyone in the office like a politician, flashing his Stanford degree and years of digital transformation expertise on his LinkedIn profile. From the start, John could see what he was: a corporate fixer. Someone who knew how to talk about systems without actually understanding them. Eric and Mark spent long hours huddled in conference rooms, their voices dropping the moment John walked by. Once, he caught a glimpse of slides on Eric's laptop, streamlining its resources and restructuring workflow efficiency. Buzzwords. John had seen those phrases 100 times before in consulting reports, always a cover for cutting costs and eliminating staff. Linda noticed the change in him before he ever said a word. One evening, as they sat together on the back porch, she studied his face while he nursed a beer. "You're distracted," she said softly. "Something going on at work?" John hesitated, staring out at the fading Texas sunset. "Just changes," he muttered. "Nothing I haven't seen before." But deep inside, he wasn't sure. The changes felt deliberate, targeted. The final confirmation came when he stumbled upon a memo. Company-wide notice about modernization initiatives. Oddly, it hadn't been sent to him directly. Found it while running a routine system scan, tucked away in a directory he still had access to. Reading through it, his stomach sank. It was a full restructuring plan for the IT department. New leadership roles were outlined, new reporting lines drawn. His own position? Not even listed. The man who had built the entire system from the ground up had been quietly erased from the company's future. John didn't lash out, didn't storm into Mark's office demanding answers. Instead, he did what he had always done best. He watched and he documented. The quiet man in the corner sees everything. It's precisely because no one expects him to. And what he saw next was far more troubling than any lost promotion. During one of his scans, he noticed irregularities in Horizon's financial software, unusual patterns, tiny payments to a vendor he didn't recognize. Most people would have ignored them. But John was not most people. He flagged them, copied the records, and tucked them away for safekeeping. At that moment, he didn't yet realize the scale of what he had uncovered. But he knew one thing for certain: Horizon Dynamics wasn't just sidelining him. They were clearing the way for something bigger, something they didn't want him to see when the day finally came. It wasn't anger that washed over John Matthews, it was betrayal. After 2 decades of loyalty, late nights, and sacrifices his family had felt as deeply as he did, Horizon Dynamics discarded him like outdated equipment. The scene replayed in his mind with unsettling clarity. Mark Dillon, the young boss with his rehearsed MBA confidence, sitting behind his polished desk as if the decision carried no weight. Beside him, Karen Lopez from HR, her eyes fixed on a sheet of paper, careful not to reveal emotion. The words had been so flat, so clinical. "We're eliminating your position. Please clear your desk by noon." No handshake. No thank you. Not even a token acknowledgement of the man who had held the company together during crises most employees never even knew about. Instead, as John carried his cardboard box toward the elevator, Mark stepped out of his office, not to say goodbye, but to watch, to make sure he really left. That, John realized, was the moment it all became clear. This wasn't just about restructuring. It wasn't just about a younger consultant or new technology. It was personal, deliberate. They weren't cutting costs. They were cutting him. His coworkers didn't know how to react. Some kept their heads down, pretending not to notice. A few offered quick, awkward goodbyes, but their eyes gave them awake, fused, even frightened. Many of them owed their own careers to John's patient training, his steady guidance when they had been overwhelmed rookies. Now they watched the man who had built the foundation beneath their feet be escorted out as if he were a stranger at his desk. John gathered his belongings with quiet dignity. He lifted the framed photo of his family, Linda smiling, their children, Adam and Rachel, both still in school back when the picture was taken. He set it carefully in the box beside the chipped coffee mug his daughter had given him for Father's Day. Finally, he reached for the small cactus that had somehow survived 20 years under the harsh fluorescent lights. That cactus had been through as much as he had, weathering storms in silence, adapting to neglect, and thriving anyway. He smiled faintly at the thought, but beneath the calm exterior, something shifted inside him. It wasn't rage, not the kind that burns hot and fades quickly. It was colder, sharper. The kind of clarity that comes when a man realizes exactly how little he means to the people he served. Mark Dillon thought he was erasing a line item on a spreadsheet. But what he didn't realize was that John Matthews carried with him more than trinkets in a cardboard box. He carried knowledge, secrets, years of records, audits, security logs that no one else even remembered existed, because while executives had treated him like background noise, John had been building something far more powerful than loyalty. He had built a trail, quiet, careful, irrefutable evidence of every irregularity that had passed through Horizon's systems. Evidence that now, with his badge surrendered and his loyalty severed, he was free to follow wherever it led. As the elevator doors slid shut, John caught one last glimpse of Mark standing there, arms crossed, satisfied. To him, it was over. The old tech guy was gone, problem solved. But to John, this was just the beginning. Walking into the parking lot, the weight of the cardboard box pressed into his arms. But it wasn't the mug or the cactus or the photo that felt heavy. It was the betrayal. The knowledge that after everything, they had chosen deceit over decency. And in that moment, he made a quiet promise to himself. If Horizon Dynamics thought they could cast him aside without consequence, they were about to learn just how dangerous it can be to underestimate the man who knows every wire, every password, every shadow of the system they believed was under their control. John Matthews set the cardboard box gently in the passenger seat of his truck, slid behind the wheel, and just sat there for a moment. Through the windshield, Horizon's glass tower gleamed in the Dallas sunlight. A monument he had helped build in ways no one outside the IT department would ever understand. He had renewed that badge hanging on his belt for 20 years. And now it was gone like he had never existed, but Horizon had made one fatal mistake. They believed that walking him out the door erased his value. What they didn't realize was that John carried with him something far more powerful than a title or an access card. He carried the company's memory, the digital bones of its history, and more importantly, the proof of everything it had tried to bury. Long ago, during a legal investigation into insider threats, the board had asked John to design a security audit system. It was supposed to be temporary, just a safeguard to appease regulators. But John, thorough as always, had done more. He had built it to last, and he had quietly preserved backups, off-site and encrypted, exactly as the legal team had once authorized. They'd forgotten about it. He never had. That evening, After Linda had gone to bed, John unlocked the bottom drawer of his home office desk. Inside was a small black case. He slid out a flash drive and held it in his palm for a long moment. It looked so ordinary: plastic, metal, nothing remarkable. Yet inside it lay years of data, audit logs, email archives, financial records that no average employee should have ever seen. He plugged it into his personal laptop, typed the passwords he alone knew, and the screen came alive with familiar files. Scrolling through the directories, John felt a strange calm wash over him. He wasn't just some discarded technician anymore. He was the quiet custodian of the truth. The executives had always underestimated him, treating him like wallpaper, invisible and unimportant. But invisibility has its advantages. No one watches the man they've dismissed. No one questions what he sees, what he saves, what he knows, and what he knew was damning. Payments to vendors that didn't exist. Invoices inflated just enough to slip through unnoticed. Authorization chains leading back to men who now strutted across the executive floor as if they were untouchable. John leaned back in his chair, staring at the glow of the screen. He remembered Linda's voice from the porch a few nights earlier, her gentle question, something going on at work? He hadn't wanted to worry her then. But now, he couldn't ignore the truth. Something was very wrong at Horizon Dynamics. He rubbed his tired eyes and stood, walking to the window. Outside, their quiet suburban street was dark. Porch lights, glowing here and there. Families were winding down, safe in their routines. But John knew his world had just shifted. He was no longer simply the man who fixed servers at 3 a.m. He was the man who held the keys to a vault of secrets that could unravel careers, even topple an empire. It wasn't anger that steadied his resolve that night. It was clarity. 420. Years. His loyalty had chained him to Horizon, keeping him silent even when decisions didn't make sense. Now that loyalty was gone, broken by betrayal, he was free to act, free to expose, free to protect the truth he alone had preserved. John Matthews had walked out of Horizon Dynamics with nothing but a cardboard box. But at home, sitting in the glow of his computer screen, he realized he had walked away with something infinitely more valuable: the power to decide what happened next. The next morning, John Matthews poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down. In his home office, the house was quiet. Linda had gone to the store, and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the background. On his desk sat the flash drive, small and unassuming, yet heavier in meaning than the box of belongings. He had carried out of Horizon's tower the day before. He slid it into his laptop and opened a set of logs he hadn't reviewed in months. The numbers stared back at him, line after line of financial transactions, neat and clinical, each stamped with dates and authorization codes. To anyone else, it would look like business as usual. But John had been watching systems for 20 years, and he knew how to spot a shadow in the data. At first, it was smaller payment here, another there, always to the same vendor, Summit Consulting Partners. The name rang no bell. John knew nearly every contractor and vendor Horizon had ever used, from the software developers in Austin to the cloud services in Seattle. But this one, it was a ghost. Curious, he pulled up the details. The listed address: a UPS store in a strip mall on the outskirts of Dallas. No office suite, no staff directory. Just a mailbox behind a counter where someone signed 4 packages. John frowned, heart beating a little faster. He cross-referenced the invoices with Horizon's software license renewals. The pattern came into focus. Every time the company renewed a critical system license, billing, payroll, customer databases, and inflated charge appeared on the ledger. 15% higher than the contract, sometimes 20%. Always approved, always signed off by the same chain of executives. He scrolled further. The numbers weren't small anymore. Over 18 months, the transfers to Summit Consulting Partners totaled nearly $5 million. John leaned back, stunned. This wasn't an accounting error. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was deliberate. Someone inside Horizon had created a shell company to siphon money through inflated invoices, millions that no one had noticed slipping away. The question was, who? He dug deeper, following the digital trail. A quick search of the business registration revealed the name on the documents, Michael Hayes. The surname caught John's attention instantly. Horizon's chief financial officer was Richard Hayes, and Michael, as it turned out, was Richard's brother-in-law. John felt the air leave his chest. The CFO himself was orchestrating the scheme, but it didn't end there. Hours of digging revealed another company, Lakeside Solutions, linked not to Richard's brother-in-law this time, but to Richard's own wife. Different name, same game. Invoices for consulting services that never happened, money wired out quietly under the guise of operational expenses. The scale of it was staggering. And all of it, every suspicious transaction, every signature, was sitting in the files. Horizon had thought John left behind. He sat in silence, staring at the screen. For years, he had been the man who solved problems, patched leaks, and kept the system safe. He had always believed his job was to protect Horizon from outside threats, hackers, malware, competitors. But now he understood the real threat had been inside all along, wearing expensive suits and shaking hands in boardrooms? Asterisk. John closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. He thought of Linda. Of the long nights she spent alone while he sat at the office, fixing problems for men who would later cast him aside without a word of thanks. He thought of his children, grown now, who had once asked why Dad couldn't be at every birthday dinner. He had given Horizon his time, his loyalty, his life. And this was what they had been doing behind closed doors. Opening his eyes, he leaned forward, hands steady on the keyboard. For the first time in days, he felt something stronger than betrayal. Purpose. He wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Horizon Dynamics believed they had erased him, that he was just an aging technician with no power left. But John Matthews had uncovered the truth, and he knew exactly what to do with it. The deeper John Matthews dug, the clearer the pattern became. At first, he thought the suspicious payments to Summit Consulting Partners were an isolated schema, clever but limited. Fraud. But like loose threads on an old sweater, the more he pulled, the more everything began to unravel. He traced Summit's registration to Michael Hayes, the brother-in-law of Horizon's chief financial officer, Richard Hayes. The connection was to direct, to ignore. It explained why every inflated invoice sailed through approvals without resistance. Family ties made it easier to hide the money trail in plain sight, but John's instincts told him it didn't stop there. He returned to the files, combing through years of transactions, looking for anything that carried the same fingerprints. And soon, he found it another vendor, Lakeside Business Solutions. At first glance, it looked like any other consulting firm, but when John checked its registration, his jaw tightened. The listed CEO was Patricia Hayes, Richard's wife. This wasn't one scheme. It was a family operation. Husband, wife, and brother-in-law had built a network of shell companies, siphoning millions out of Horizon Dynamics under the cover of consulting fees and software renewals. To the untrained eye, the invoices appeared legitimate. After all, Horizon really did renew those licenses, really did hire outside consultants. But the numbers were always inflated. The charges padded just enough to escape suspicion. John stared at the data, shaking his head slowly. For years, while he had been working nights and weekends, missing birthdays and anniversaries, Richard Hayes had been bleeding the company dry. And the executives who prided themselves on oversight had either been complicit or willfully blind. He thought back to Mark Dillon, his young boss who had smiled too often in meetings and waved off John's concerns about future-proofing the systems, and to Eric Lawson, the polished consultant, whose presence suddenly made more sense. They weren't just restructuring IT for efficiency, they were clearing a path. John had been the one man who might notice the irregularities, the quiet watchdog. They couldn't control. Removing him wasn't coincidence, it was necessity. The betrayal cut deeper than the firing itself. John had believed in Horizon Dynamics. He had sacrificed for them, even defended the company when competitors tried to lure him away. He had stayed out of loyalty while the people at the top had been treating the company like their personal ATM. That night, sitting alone in his office at home, John scrolled through the evidence again. Every payment, every inflated invoice, every signature of approval. It was all there, a meticulous trail they never expected anyone to piece together. And now, he had it in his hands. Linda knocked softly on the door before poking her head in. "You're still at it?" she asked, her voice gentle. John looked up, weary but steady. "I think I've found something," he said quietly. Her eyes searched his. "Something serious?" "Very serious." He turned back to the screen, the glow reflecting in his glasses. "It's not just mismanagement. It's theft, and it's coming straight from the top." For a long moment, Linda didn't speak. She knew the man she married, knew that once he latched onto the truth, he wouldn't let it go. Finally, she stepped into the room, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then you know what you have to do?" John nodded slowly. Yes, he knew the betrayal was no longer just personal, it was criminal. And now that he had pulled back the curtain, there was no turning away. Horizon's leadership thought they had silenced him, but they had done the opposite. They had unleashed him. Somewhere in that maze of numbers and names, John Matthews had found his purpose again. He wasn't just a man who had lost his job. He was the man who could bring down an empire built on greed, and he intended to see it through. The more John Matthews studied the records, the more he realized the fraud wasn't just the handiwork of Richard Hayes and his family. No, this scheme had help inside help. And when John pieced together the details, the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. It was Mark Dillon. His boss, Mark, had been the one to slowly cut John out of projects, to change his access privileges, to label him old school and out of touch. John had chalked it up to generational differences, to the arrogance of a young executive eager to prove himself. But the files told a different story. Tucked inside the email archives were messages between Mark and Richard Hayes. They weren't explicit. Fraud rarely is. But John knew how to read between the lines. References to ensuring compliance and expedited approvals, paired perfectly with the timeline of Summit and Lakeside invoices. Each time an inflated bill hit the system, Mark signed off on budget reallocations that funneled extra money toward Hayes' department. It was a bargain. It's plain and simple. Richard got the funds he needed to siphon money through his family's shell companies. And Mark got to look like a rising star who had secured extra budget while other departments were being cut. The betrayal stung sharper than John expected. Mark wasn't just complicit. He had orchestrated John's removal. He hadn't wanted an experienced systems analyst digging into the numbers, someone too thorough to ignore the anomalies. John wasn't pushed out because he was obsolete. He was pushed out because he was dangerous to the scheme. And then there was Eric Lawson, the polished consultant who strolled into Horizon like a knight in shining armor. John had distrusted him from the start, the way he dropped buzzwords like digital transformation and streamlined integration, the way he avoided answering technical questions directly. But now, the picture snapped into focus. Eric's consulting firm had bypassed Horizon's normal procurement channels. There were no competitive bids, no oversight committee review, nothing. He'd been handpicked, ushered in by Mark and Richard under the guise of modernizing IT. His true purpose wasn't to build the future, it was to eliminate. The one man who still remembered the past. John leaned back in his chair, staring at the files with cold clarity. 3 men, working in tandem. Richard Hayes, the CFO siphoning millions. Mark Dillon, the ambitious boss who cleared obstacles. And Eric Lawson, the consultant, brought in to make the whole thing look legitimate. It was elegant in its simplicity. Create shell companies, inflate invoices, funnel the money through family, and silence anyone who might notice. And they had. Almost succeeded. Almost. John's mind drifted back over the last 6 months to the subtle changes he had brushed aside. The meetings where his input was ignored. The projects reassigned without explanation. The access restrictions that had seemed so minor at the time. They hadn't been random. They had been calculated moves in a slow, careful campaign to push him out before he uncovered what they were doing. Well, they'd underestimated him. That night, John sat at his kitchen table with Linda, explaining everything he had found. She listened silently, her hands folded on the table, her eyes fixed on his. When he finished, she let out a slow breath. "So they didn't just fire you," she said softly. "They tried to erase you. 'Cause you were the only one who could see it. John nodded. They thought they were being clever, but they left fingerprints everywhere. I've got them all. Linda reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Then you have to make sure the right people see it. Her words lingered in his mind long after she had gone to bed. He stared at the files glowing on his laptop screen, knowing she was right. He couldn't bury this. Couldn't let Horizon's leadership get away with bleeding the company dry while treating loyal workers like expendable tools. The betrayal was now crystal clear. And so was his path forward. The quiet man they thought they had silenced was about to become their biggest threat. John Matthews had spent a lifetime solving problems others didn't even see. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, and he certainly wasn't the kind of man who played politics. But sitting in his home office, surrounded by years of hidden audit files, he understood that if he wanted justice, he had to do something he'd never done before: go on the offensive. This wasn't a battle he could fight head-on. Marching back into Horizon Dynamics with accusations would only get him labeled as bitter, disgruntled, and irrelevant. Men like Richard Hayes and Mark Dillon were experts at spinning narratives. They would bury him in legal threats, brand him as an angry former employee, and carry on with their scheme while he was silenced. No, this required precision, patience, strategy. He spent 2 days compiling a comprehensive report. Spreadsheets traced the inflated invoices to Summit Consulting Partners and Lakeside Business Solutions. Business registrations tied the companies directly to Hayes' brother-in-law. Emails linked Dillon to budget approvals that made the siphoning possible. Even Eric Lawson's consulting contract, slipped through without oversight, became part of the chain of evidence. Every piece fit like cogs in a machine, undeniable and damning. But John didn't intend to hand it straight to the people running the company. Instead, he thought back to the one man at Horizon he trusted, Robert Lang, a longtime board member. Years earlier, John had worked with him during a security upgrade. Unlike the other executives, Robert had asked real questions, listened carefully, and read the fine print of the reports. He wasn't the type to dismiss details. He was the type who understood that details mattered. John called him on a Wednesday morning. "Robert, it's John Matthews. Long time?" There was a pause on the line before Robert's deep voice answered. "John, I heard you left Horizon." "Not by choice," John replied. His tone was steady, almost clinical. "I need 15 minutes of your time. It's important." Robert didn't hesitate. "Meet me in an hour. Same park we used to cut through on lunch breaks." An hour later, John handed him a plain envelope. Inside was a printed summary and a flash drive containing the full report. "I'm not asking for my job back," John said. "And I don't want money. I just want the truth in the right hands." Robert studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If this is what I think it is, you've just handed me a stick of dynamite." "Then make sure it lands where it should," John said. As he walked back to his truck, a strange calm filled him. For the first time since his firing, he wasn't reacting, he was acting. That night, John set up one last safeguard. Using credentials Horizon should have revoked but hadn't. He logged into the company's email server and scheduled a message to every board member. It was time to deliver just before their next finance committee meeting. Attached was his full report. If Robert didn't ignore if someone tried to bury it, the email would force the issue into the open. Then he sat back, watching the glow of the Dallas skyline in the distance. The company that thought it had erased him was about to face the man it had underestimated. John Matthews had never been a man of confrontation. But sometimes silence is not weakness, it's strategy. And now, after 20 years of being the quiet man in the corner, he was ready to let his evidence speak louder than any words ever could. Friday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of Texas autumn day where the air feels lighter, almost expectant. John Matthews sat on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, the sun climbing slowly over the rooftops of his quiet neighborhood. He didn't have to rush to beat traffic or fight through another endless meeting. His only task today was to wait at exactly 8 a.m. The email he had scheduled days earlier delivered itself to every member of Horizon's board. His report, meticulous and undeniable, landed in their inboxes minutes before the finance committee convened. By 8:17, his phone was already buzzing with numbers he didn't recognize. He let them all go to voicemail. At 9 o'clock, the committee meeting began. By 9:30, the fallout had already started. A text flashed on his phone from Stephen, one of the junior analysts John had mentored. "Police are here." Hayes and Dylan being questioned. Lawson looked sick. "What did you do?" John didn't reply. He didn't need to. The wheels were turning exactly as he'd planned. Later that afternoon, Robert Lang called. His voice was blunt, almost breathless. "It's a bloodbath, John. Hayes confessed as soon as we confronted him with your evidence. He's trying to blame Dylan. Dylan's denying everything. Lawson claims he knew nothing. The board's suspended. All three. Forensic accountants are digging deeper looks like more than 5 million siphoned off." John sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of it. Justice was finally catching up with the people who had discarded him. Within days, local business outlets carried headlines about financial irregularities at Horizon Dynamics. Within weeks, charges were filed. Hayes pled guilty in exchange for leniency. Dylan lawyered up, swearing he was innocent. Lawson fled the country, only to face extradition later. The empire they had built on deception crumbled under the weight of the truth, but the story didn't end there. The board, desperate to stabilize the company, turned to the one man who had exposed it all. They offered John a newly created role, Chief Information Security Officer, reporting directly to the board. At first he hesitated. After all, Horizon had betrayed him once, why trust them again? But this time was different. This time, he would set the terms when he walked into that boardroom in a suit he hadn't worn in years. He laid down his conditions: full audit authority across every department, an independent budget, and the power to veto any financial technology. A decision that bypassed security. Unusual, the interim CEO said. John's reply was steady. So was embezzling $5 million. By noon, they had accepted every demand. 6 months later, John sat in his new office overlooking the Dallas skyline. He had promoted Stephen to lead day-to-day IT operations, knowing the young man had potential and needed someone to believe in him. Horizon's culture had shifted. People no longer looked past the quiet IT man. They looked to him with respect. At lunch, Linda walked into his office with her easy smile. "Ready?" she asked. As they walked out together, employees glanced up, not out of fear, but admiration. John hadn't destroyed Horizon Dynamics. He had saved it. And in the process, he had rebuilt himself. The anger that once burned in him had cooled, replaced by something stronger: satisfaction. He hadn't sought revenge. He had sought truth. That truth had prevailed. John's story reminds us of a powerful truth. Never underestimate the quiet, steady soul who works without applause. Sometimes the people we overlook are the very ones holding everything together. And sometimes, when betrayal comes, they are the ones strong enough to bring justice to light. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comment side. Love to hear your perspective. And if you want more stories of resilience, justice, and life lessons, make sure to subscribe and stay connected. Because sometimes the most powerful victories don't come from shouting the loudest. They come from standing firm when it matters most.